My parents taught me to keep my feelings hidden. Now, my parents wonder why I keep my distance. I'm a 32-year-old man reflecting on a childhood dominated by emotional suppression. Growing up, my family lived by an unspoken rule: toughen up. Displaying emotions was not just discouraged, it was often ridiculed. From an early age, my parents enforced a strict code of stoicism. They expected me to maintain composure at all times. Whenever I shed tears or expressed displeasure, even in genuinely distressing situations, the response was predictable. My father would dismissively state that life isn't fair and that mastering one's emotions was a sign of strength. My mother would echo his sentiments, seemingly approving only when I managed to keep my feelings under wrap. My younger brother, however, was different. He naturally wore his emotions on his sleeve, reacting visibly to criticism or showing enthusiasm over trivial joys. This openness rarely served him well in our household. Despite his efforts to conform, it was a struggle for him. Observing his challenges, I concluded that emotional neutrality was essential for survival under our roof. I became adept at suppressing my emotions, hiding any signs of sadness, frustration, or even happiness. This seemed simpler than facing the inevitable scrutiny. This emotional facade extended to my school life as well. I had friends, yet none knew the real me. My inability to share genuine feelings prevented these relationships from progressing beyond superficial interactions. How could I discuss anything of substance when I had been conditioned to bottle everything up? There was a palpable barrier between myself and others, one that I felt but could not dismantle. My vulnerability remained shielded, preventing any deep connection with peers. At home, the pressure was relentless. My parents set towering standards: excellence in academics, sports, and conduct. They might not have articulated it directly, but their message was clear: I was never enough. No matter my achievements, they invariably found flaws. Even family events were exercises in pretense, with everyone playing their part to uphold a facade of perfection. Everything was meticulously crafted to appear flawless and cohesive, even if it meant feigning a closeness that wasn't there. I cannot remember a single sincere moment of warmth or bonding during those family events. It was all a facade. As a teenager, there were times when I considered challenging the status quo, perhaps showing a bit of emotion or voicing a dissenting opinion. Such efforts invariably met with severe repercussions. My parents would react as though I had committed a grave violation, quickly and harshly silencing me. It felt like a metaphorical slap each time. Eventually, I stopped. I hesitated, knowing they might perceive it as a critique of their parenting rather than an attempt to mend our relationship. I questioned whether they realized how much I had evolved from the reticent child they used to know. The idea of disclosing my feelings seemed fraught with risk, yet I was also weary of the emotional distance and the ever-present tension in our interactions. I longed for understanding, although I doubted their ability to empathize with my perspective. Now, as I contemplated opening up to them, I was torn between apprehension and a resolve to try. It felt like peering into an abyss of uncertainty about their response. Part of me held onto a sliver of hope that they might listen and comprehend, while another part braced for potential disappointment. Nevertheless, I decided it was time to confront the issue. Update 1. On the day I chose to return home and address the growing rift, I was unsure of the outcome. I hadn't scripted my words, but my objective was clear. They needed to grasp the reasons behind my detachment. I informed them of my visit and that I'd join them for dinner, then drove there after work, managing my anxiety. Upon arrival, the setting was all too familiar. My mother busied herself in the kitchen with the final touches on the meal, while my father lounged in the living room, absorbed in his phone. Their greetings were cordial, yet somewhat perfunctory. My mother quickly noted my solemn demeanor, making a teasing remark I had heard often. I responded with a smile, sidestepping the provocation. My father acknowledged me with a nod before returning to his reading. Dinner commenced with typical small talk, queries about my job and if I had any plans to buy a house, the usual milestones they like to check off. Then, they noted how reserved I still appeared, in stark contrast to my younger brother, who had seemingly outgrown such a phase long ago. I let the conversation flow naturally, choosing my words with care and maintaining a light tone while subtly guiding the discussion towards more meaningful territory. The opportunity arose when they began another update about my cousins and their families. I seized the moment to shift the focus, mentioning that I had been reflecting on our family dynamic. This comment drew their attention, and although my mom looked at me curiously, I continued, suggesting that growing up, There seemed to be an unspoken rule against showing emotion. My father quickly dismissed this with a typical response, Vive, well, we raised you to be strong, didn't we? His words were predictable, but I gently pressed on, explaining that the type of strength they instilled often made it difficult for me to be open with them. My approach was cautious, yet even then I could see my mom's demeanor change to one of defensiveness, as if she perceived my words as an indictment of their parenting style. My father reiterated their philosophy of tough love, asserting it was necessary to equip me for life's challenges. Encouraged by their engagement, I decided to delve deeper and shared specific incidents from my childhood, times when expressing any emotion led to lectures rather than support. Their reactions were telling. My mom appeared genuinely taken aback, claiming she didn't recall those instances as I described. My dad, meanwhile, seemed uneasy, choosing to look down at his plate rather than respond. It felt as though I was speaking to an impervious barrier. Despite my efforts to remain composed, frustration began to simmer within me. I had hoped that openly discussing these experiences would help them understand my perspective, but they seemed more inclined to justify their actions than to listen genuinely. After an awkward silence, my mom offered a terse apology, admitting that perhaps they had been overly strict at times. However, her acknowledgement was quickly qualified with the rationale that discipline was necessary. My dad remained silent, his discomfort palpable, yet he avoided further discussion. He simply nodded now and then, clearly eager for the discussion to conclude. The sting of disappointment was profound. This attempt to truly open up and show them the impact of their parenting choices was met not with understanding, but with justifications for every decision they had made. I drove away that evening feeling more estranged from them than ever, questioning whether I should have broached the subject at all. It seemed unlikely that they would ever see me for the person I had become, rather than the reserved child they remembered. Once home, I reached out to a close friend who had navigated similar familial challenges. Her empathy was a comfort. She listened attentively, affirming my feelings. Our conversation lifted some of the burden I'd been shouldering. She encouraged me to consider therapy. It wasn't that she thought I was broken, but she believed external support could be beneficial. I had previously dismissed the idea of therapy, confident in my ability to manage alone. However, this latest exchange with my parents revealed the depth of unresolved issues, prompting me to seek professional help. By the following day, I had contacted a therapist specializing in family dynamics and childhood emotional well-being. Making that appointment was a significant, albeit daunting, step forward. I'm not expecting instant solutions, but I recognize the necessity of addressing these issues head-on. Therapy begins next week, and while I'm apprehensive, there's also a sense of relief. Whether or not my parents ever come to understand me, it's time I understood myself. This path is no longer about altering their perspectives, but about fostering my own growth and healing. It's about finally releasing the grip they've had on my life. Update 2. Beginning therapy felt like unlocking a door that had been sealed shut for decades. My therapist, a gentle and soft-spoken woman, skillfully navigated through my childhood recollections. Each session, I shared experiences, moments when any attempt to express emotion was swiftly suppressed, and years of being conditioned to repress everything. At first, I wasn't sure where to begin, but she adeptly deconstructed each memory, illuminating recurring patterns I had never recognized. The discussions gradually revealed the profound impact of my strict upbringing. I always knew it wasn't healthy, but I hadn't fully understood the extent to which it had molded my self-perception and interpersonal relationship. I realized why I found it so challenging to connect with others and why showing vulnerability seemed insurmountable. The therapy sessions were like dismantling a barrier I hadn't even realized existed. In one of the sessions, my therapist introduced me to new coping strategies. Rather than suppressing uncomfortable emotions, she taught me to acknowledge and sit with them. This approach initially seemed overly simplistic, but I decided to embrace it. She suggested I start journaling, encouraging me to write freely without self-censorship. This practice gradually helped me reconnect with my own needs and emotions, aspects of myself I had long neglected. During this period, my parents began to reach out more, pushing for frequent visits. Unaware of my therapy and personal introspection, each of their calls subtly implied guilt, suggesting I was neglecting family duties. I kept our conversations brief, but the constant pressure soon became overwhelming. My therapist advised me to establish boundaries to safeguard my mental health progress. The concept of setting boundaries was foreign to me. I had never imagined that it was permissible to establish limits with my parents. Trusting her guidance, I began to reduce our interactions. I informed my parents that my work schedule was hectic and that I couldn't visit as often. Occasionally, I let their calls go unanswered, directing them to voicemail. Their response was predictably intense. They increased their calls, leaving messages accusing me of abandoning the family. One evening, my mother left a lengthy voicemail expressing how much they had sacrificed for me and demanding more respect. It was tempting to yield to their demands. I had been raised to believe that respecting them meant acquiescing to their wishes. However, I recognized that complying with their expectations would only mean sidelining my own needs once more. Therapy was making a significant difference, and I was determined not to regress, so I resisted the guilt they tried to impose on me. Each time I stood my ground, I experienced a boost in confidence, reinforcing that I was doing this for my well-being. Over the following weeks, therapy continued to be a source of empowerment. I began noticing subtle changes in how I expressed myself. In the safe space of therapy, I could articulate my feelings without fear of judgment. The more I practiced, the more natural it became to extend this openness to other areas of my life. Gradually, I was building self-esteem and gaining a sense of control that had eluded me before. One evening, my younger brother reached out. He had noticed my withdrawal from family engagements and shared that he, too, felt burdened by our parents' expectations. While he wasn't ready to confront them directly, he was comforted to know he wasn't alone. Our conversation marked the first time we openly discussed these issues, forging a stronger connection between us. We spent hours sharing experiences, acknowledging the weight we had each been carrying in solitude. He even expressed admiration for the boundaries I was establishing, encouraging me to persist. His support inspired me to attempt another discussion about my emotional boundaries with our parents. I approached the conversation simply, stating my need for space to focus on personal growth and explaining that their frequent demands were counterproductive. I sensed their resistance immediately. My father defensively argued they were just trying to maintain family unity, while my mother minimized my concerns. Although I encountered the familiar resistance, there was a slight shift this time. They paused occasionally during our talk, and I thought I detected a hint of understanding. I later discussed this with my therapist, who reminded me that my journey was about personal growth, not about changing their perspectives. Her advice resonated with me, helping me realize that I had been clinging to the hope that they would someday understand. Accepting that they might never fully grasp my feelings was difficult, but necessary. Now, I'm focused on maintaining my boundaries and gradually accepting that my parents may never completely understand my point of view. For the first time, I felt at peace with my decision. Update 3. In the weeks following the establishment of my boundaries, it became clear that my parents were not taking them seriously. The phone calls persisted, each one filled with seemingly innocent inquiries that were actually attempts to draw me back in. My mother, in particular, began subtly mentioning family events and emphasizing how much I was missed. Her hints were anything but subtle, and each reference seemed to disregard the explanations I had provided previously. One evening, she left a voicemail about an upcoming family dinner expecting my attendance. I took a moment to compose myself before returning her call to firmly decline. Her reaction was immediate and sharp. She chastised me for my absence, accusing me of ingratitude for all they had done. In the background, my father suggested that therapy had brainwashed me, claiming I had lost sight of what family meant. The conversation escalated quickly from there. As they continued to pressure me, I reached my breaking point. I explained that my boundaries were not an indication of diminished care, but their relentless pressure was undermining any chance of a healthy relationship. I expressed the frustration that had accumulated over years of being dismissed and having to suppress my feelings to keep the peace. For the first time, I did not hold back. I recounted every instance I could recall where I had been silenced or instructed to toughen up or be less sensitive. My father retorted, accusing me of overreacting and showing disrespect. He dismissed my concerns as mere acts of rebellion despite my age. My mother insisted they had raised me well and that the detachment I was showing wasn't reflective of my true character. After a heated exchange, I made it clear that if they could not respect my boundaries, I would need to distance myself further, both emotionally and physically. Ending that call, I felt an unusual relief, though I was aware they would not take our conversation lightly. Shortly after my brother contacted me, he had learned about the argument from our mother, who portrayed me as turning my back on the family. Instead of echoing her sentiments, he expressed understanding and shared that he had noticed the same patterns but was not yet ready to address them. It was incredibly comforting to know I wasn't facing this alone. My brother promised we'd stay connected and support each other through any potential repercussion. My close friends also stood by me. They had witnessed the strain my family's expectations had caused. They affirmed that setting boundaries was not only correct, but necessary. They reassured me that I was justified in safeguarding my own peace. For the first time, I felt truly supported by people who understood my needs. They encouraged me not to compromise my well-being just to maintain harmony. Armed with this support, I began to rediscover and invest in my personal interests. I re-engaged with my hobbies and professional life, diving into projects I had shelved for far too long. Whether it was acquiring new skills or immersing myself in creative endeavors, I was reconnecting with parts of myself that I had neglected. For the first time in a long time, I felt in control of my time and free from the constant anxiety of family expectations. However, my parents continued their attempts to reach out. They sent letters, each echoing nostalgia for the person I was before, the version of me that didn't stir conflict or assert boundaries. My mother's letters expressed a longing for our past closeness, which gave me mixed emotions. While part of me felt guilty, I also recognized these messages for what they were: attempts to resurrect a version of myself that conformed without question. I remained resolute, understanding that reverting to that state of compliance was not an option. A few weeks later, an update from my brother revealed that our parents were beginning to see the effects of their actions, not just on me, but on him as well. Though his approach was subtler than mine, his gradual withdrawal had led them to reflect on their behavior. This acknowledgement from them, albeit minor, was a sign of progress. Throughout this period, my therapist provided unwavering support, urging me to concentrate on my personal development instead of trying to change their perspectives. She reinforced the value of the strides I had made, reminding me of the importance of maintaining this newfound strength. Each therapy session bolstered my resolve and helped fortify my sense of autonomy. Shortly thereafter, I received an invitation to a family gathering. The sight of the invitation alone stirred familiar anxieties. I pondered how they might treat me or comment on my recent decisions. After careful consideration, I opted not to attend and sent a courteous message explaining my absence. Surprisingly, the anticipated backlash did not materialize. Instead, there was silence from my parents, a silence that, while initially disconcerting, seemed to signify a reluctant acknowledgement of the boundaries I had set. For the first time, I experienced a sense of genuine liberation from their expectations and the fear of letting them down. Navigating this path was challenging, yet asserting myself, despite the potential for conflict, seemed the only viable route. The future of my relationship with my parents remained uncertain, but I was confident in the robust foundation of self-respect I had established. After deciding to skip the event, I braced for the reactions that soon followed. My phone was inundated with inquiries from relatives. Some were concerned about my well-being, while others expressed disappointment at my absence. The most direct criticisms, however, came from my parents. They expressed deep disappointment in a message, accusing me of being selfish and ungrateful, suggesting I had forsaken family values over minor grievances. Their harsh words were painful, yet unsurprising. They seized this chance to reinforce their view that emotions and setting boundaries constituted weakness. I discussed these messages during my next therapy session, where my therapist offered a valuable insight. Their reaction stemmed more from their own insecurities and fears than from any faults in my actions. She explained that parents who perceive boundaries as threats often struggle with changes in family dynamics, a perspective that helped mitigate the harshness of their words. Despite this, feelings of guilt occasionally resurfaced, making me question whether I had distanced myself too much. During this reflective period, I received an unexpected note from my aunt, my mother's sister. It had been years since we last spoke, but she reached out to me privately after learning about the recent family gathering. My aunt reached out, sharing that she had encountered similar challenges with my parents and had often felt marginalized within our family. Her stories of unspoken expectations and quiet judgments provided a significant connection, making me realize I wasn't alone in this struggle. Her insights reaffirmed that establishing boundaries was not inherently wrong, but rather difficult for those unaccustomed to setting them. During this period, another conversation with my brother revealed that he, too, felt overwhelmed by the burden of our parents' expectations. He shared his difficulties in navigating their constant oversight and his hesitation to assert himself as I had. Our discussion solidified our bond. We were not just siblings, but allies grappling with similar challenges, which brought a sense of solidarity and purpose. This motivated me further, knowing that my actions might inspire him to find his own path to autonomy. Motivated by these developments, I opted for a new tactic with my parents. I composed an email with precise boundaries, articulating them with respect, yet firmness, detailing what interactions I was willing to engage in and what I must refuse to maintain a healthier emotional environment. I clarified that these boundaries were not an act of rejection, but a step towards fostering a more constructive relationship. I spent several hours crafting my message to ensure clarity and prevent any misunderstandings. Their reply was swift and dismissive, labeling my boundaries as childish and emphasizing that family should always take precedence over personal sentiments. They accused me of behaving like a defiant youth, complicating family matters over trivial issues. However, this time, their criticisms did not devastate me. The support from therapy and my network had bolstered my resilience, allowing me to detach my self-esteem from their validation. I now recognize their responses as efforts to maintain the status quo, to keep me confined to the role they had always expected me to play. As the days unfolded, I increasingly relied on my support network. My friends continually affirmed the necessity of boundaries, my aunt periodically checked on my well-being, and my brother and I exchanged more experiences about handling family pressures. Their support solidified my confidence in the choices I was making. Then, an unexpected shift occurred. My parents, recognizing my firm stance, ceased communication. What started as days of silence stretched into weeks. This quiet was unfamiliar and somewhat unsettling. On one level, the absence of their critiques and demands brought a sense of relief I hadn't realized I needed. Yet on another level, I was anxious about the implications of this prolonged silence. Despite these concerns, I reminded myself that this was part of the adjustment to a new dynamic, and I was prepared to continue advancing. In this newfound quietude, I pursued personal endeavors with renewed vigor. I dedicated myself to my career and revisited a creative endeavor I had long set aside. Freed from the relentless familial pressures, I began to craft a life distinctly my own. Unexpectedly, I received a handwritten letter from my mother. Unlike previous correspondences, this one carried a gentler tone and less blame. She wrote of missing our past closeness, avoiding their typical grievances, yet it was apparent she still hadn't grasped why I needed boundaries. There was no acknowledgement of their past errors or any indication that she understood the consequences of their actions. The letter stirred a mix of feelings. I was touched by the less confrontational approach and her initiative to connect, but it was disheartening that she hadn't recognized the damage their past behavior had caused or the necessity of my boundaries. It became clear that resolving these issues wouldn't be swift or straightforward. However, my need for their validation had diminished. My priority was to maintain and enjoy the independence and authenticity I was cultivating in my life. This new reality wasn't flawless, but it was genuine, and I was ready to accept it, whatever the outcome might be. Update 5. After contemplating my mother's letter for several days, I decided it was time to reply. This response was crucial, not just to reassert my boundaries, but to potentially foster some level of understanding. I approached this reply with the intent to bridge our perspectives. I dedicated several hours to composing a thoughtful reply, carefully selecting each word to convey my feelings accurately. I expressed my desire for a closer relationship with my parents, emphasizing that such closeness needed to be rooted in mutual respect and understanding. I clarified that my intention wasn't to blame or criticize, but to share my perspective so they could understand my need for boundaries. In my letter, I stressed the importance of family while explaining that establishing boundaries was crucial for my personal safety and respect. I explained that these boundaries were not a means of rejection, but a way to safeguard my well-being. The goal was to foster a healthy adult relationship, not perpetuate our old dynamics where I felt like a child who needed to be corrected. Shortly after they received my letter, my mother called. Her tone was gentler and carried a touch of emotion, confusion and pain rather than anger. She questioned the necessity of the changes I was implementing and why they were required. This prompted a long and unexpectedly emotional conversation. I took the opportunity to detail specific instances from my past, moments when I felt dismissed or penalized for my vulnerability, and the enduring effects of those experiences. I was forthright and unreserved, hoping to help her grasp the full scope of my experiences. For the first time, it seemed she was truly listening, reflecting in silence for extended periods as I spoke. After some time, she acknowledged that she hadn't realized the depth of the impact her parenting style had on me. She confessed that she believed she was doing the right thing by instilling toughness and resilience in me, but now she was beginning to question that approach given the outcomes it produced. This admission marked a subtle yet significant shift towards understanding. Eventually, my father joined the conversation. His reaction was less receptive. He appeared irritated, questioning the purpose of revisiting the past and dismissing my concerns as overly dramatic. He even insinuated that I might be exaggerating the severity of my feelings, which, while disappointing, was somewhat anticipated. This time around, I maintained my composure during the conversation with my father. I explained to him that this wasn't about creating drama, it was about safeguarding my mental health. I suggested that if he couldn't understand that, perhaps it was better we didn't continue our discussion for now. He didn't linger on the call after that. Once he hung up, my mother's demeanor softened significantly. She confided that she too had been taught to suppress her emotions growing up, and she realized she might have inadvertently passed this behavior on to us. Her acknowledgement was unexpected. She quietly apologized, expressing regret for the difficulties her parenting style may have caused. She admitted she was uncertain about how to amend things, but was open to suggestions. I recommended that perhaps she and my father could benefit from therapy as well. I explained how therapy had helped me gain insights into my behavior and improve my emotional connections without placing blame. Surprisingly, she said she would consider it. She thanked me for being open and shared a moment of vulnerability that was new to her. It wasn't a complete resolution, but it felt like we had reached a pivotal moment, a potential beginning for change. After the call, I updated my brother on the conversation. He was taken aback, but felt optimistic about the changes. He shared his thoughts on implementing his own boundaries and decided to start taking steps in that direction. Knowing we had each other's support made the prospect less intimidating. In the weeks that followed, I observed subtle but meaningful changes in how my family interacted with me. My parents, particularly my mother, became more considerate during our conversations. They seemed to choose their words more thoughtfully and avoided their previously judgmental tones. One day, my mother texted just to ask how I was, with no underlying motives or attempts to guilt me. While it wasn't a complete transformation, it was a significant shift that I hadn't anticipated happening so quickly. Meanwhile, I continued to focus on my personal development, relishing the newfound space to grow without feeling the need to constantly be on guard. I felt a profound sense of pride in the strides I'd made and cherished the emotional liberty I had worked so hard to achieve. Doubts occasionally surfaced, but each time I reminded myself of the distance I had traveled. Then, unexpectedly, another letter from my mom arrived. It was more composed than the previous one, focusing primarily on updates about how she and my father were managing. In her letter, she shared that she had started exploring emotional health resources to better grasp the concepts I'd discussed. While she didn't delve into past events, she acknowledged how much she appreciated my openness. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was progress, and her efforts felt sincere. Storing the letter away, I was struck by a newfound tranquility. The path to understanding with my family was still unfolding, and I was aware that it might take time for them to fully grasp everything. Yet, for the first time, I felt a genuine sense of optimism. I had laid a strong foundation of self-respect, established firm boundaries, and perhaps most importantly, I had initiated what could eventually lead to a healthier, more honest relationship. This process wasn't about instantly resolving all issues or forgetting the past. It was about establishing a new standard for our interactions, one where I could remain true to myself without compromising my own well-being. Regardless of how things with my family progressed, I felt confident in my ability to continue forward step by step.